Welcome, everybody. I hope you guys are in the right sessions. Practical virtual reality for Disney theme parks. Thank you guys all for coming. I know it's early from a late night of partying. I'm sure all of you guys went to some great parties. My name is Bei Yang. I work for Walt Disney Imagineering. I'm a creative technology executive there. You can follow me on Twitter at BeiYangles. So for those of you guys that don't know what Walt Disney Imagineering is, Walt Disney Imagineering is the theme park design arm of the Walt Disney Company. We are responsible for creating all of the parks, all of the hotels, as well as any of the cruise lines. But what we're really into is creating immersive experiences. And some people at Imagineering would say that those immersive experiences are the original virtual reality. So when I say virtual reality, what do you guys all think of? Well, you maybe think of this, right? Virtual reality right now, it's a hot topic. It's kind of the wave of the future. It was also the wave of the future in the past and the far past. Of course, when I say the far past, I actually only mean 1965, because let's face it, computer graphics hasn't been around for a long time. So one of the forefathers of computer graphics said in a treatise that he wrote for the ultimate display, what would that be? It would be a room within which the computer can control the existence of matter. A chair displayed in such a room would be good enough to sit in, handcuffs displayed in such a room would be confining, and a bullet displayed in such a room would be fatal. Of course, this was all turned into some science fiction, and we all know it today as the holodeck. So it's like half a century later. Where's my holodeck? So let's take a look at history right now and what really happened to the holodeck. So 1968, Ivan Sutherland created what is effectively the first head-mounted display. Of course, there was limited technology at the time. 1972, around 1976, birth of modern computer graphics. We had Future World, one of the first movies to use CG. And of course, some great advances, texture mapping and Z-buffering, for example, for those of you guys that know about computer graphics. And of course, at around the 80s, 1994, for the first time ever, we could use real-time rendering from a company that we know as SGI. And they grew very large and took over a campus. But of course, they are no longer there. And at the same time, Disney was investing heavily in panoramic videos, which is, again, something that we're seeing a resurgence of. We, at that time, called it circle vision. And we had these giant camera rigs that would allow us to capture movies in full 360 degrees, and we could show these. And then around 1993, people were like, wait a minute, we can actually go beyond head-mounted displays. We can use digital projection, and the cave systems were born. Right around the same time, Disney invested heavily in VR. We wanted to buy the future. We knew that VR was going to be the future, so we created Imagineering Labs at Epcot, as well as the more commercial product, Disney Quest. And then, of course, there was some venture capital funding at that point, and the company Virtuality in 1994 had the first VR startup to make commercially available VR systems. It had a motion tracker, as well as a hand tracker, and a head-mounted display. Right around 1995, the market caught up. They're like, VR is the future. We had the Sega VR, the Virtual Boy, and of course, Disney Quest actually built some places in around the country. And right around 1995 to 2010, it kind of dried up. We're like, what happened? What happened to VR? So SGI kind of went away. That campus is now, by the way, Google's campus. Disney Quest in Chicago, that was the last one we ever built. I personally think that maybe because it didn't serve alcohol, that's why it can get all the convention crowds, such as yourself, to go to it. And of course, Sega VR and Virtual Boy didn't really sell. But it's actually not that dark. Because all the SGI employees retaining all of that knowledge went on to go to NVIDIA and ATI. The military continued to use VR for training, so all of the hardware kept going. Disney used VR internally to develop attractions. So, for example, we still use it as a tool. It wasn't necessarily a guest-facing thing, but we used it internally as a tool. And of course, the cell phone and the digital media market developed, so now we all have digital projectors, the cell phone market developed, and shaders and better rendering techniques developed. So we have all of this new capabilities that we can now do. And of course, motion capture at that time was also in its infantile state, and now it's becoming more mature due to the movie industry having to have very high-quality motion capture. So let's talk about what happened the last few times. Was it the fact that we didn't have enough money? That's not really the focus of this presentation. So I'm going to go into how Disney, in the last kind of 20 years, now thinks about VR. So what does the future hold? Is it perhaps this? But the thing I really want to come across is I'm at the Game Developers Conference. I've been coming for several years. And I really want to say that in terms of the virtual reality world and the future that we're coming, you guys are going to be the ones that create it. because ultimately games, as it stands right now, and maybe it won't be called games in the future, but ultimately you guys are positioned to be the best bearers of virtual reality and creating immersive experiences, because real-time graphics, as well as interactive play, is something that is fundamental to the world of virtual reality. And there's 2 points that I really want to get across from you, and these are the two. When you think about VR, I really want you to think about that it's more than just head-mounted displays. It is creating those immersive experiences. And when you think about creating those immersive experiences, don't think about it in terms of how you've been thinking about games, because it's really thinking about the human perceptual system. And what do I mean by that? And let me put a big disclaimer that this is my personal hypothesis. This has not been tested in any way. How many of you guys are familiar with the uncanny valley, by show of hands? Okay, so I don't really have to explain this. The uncanny valley, as you go towards realism, there's a little bit of human discomfort. This, of course, is the valley. So as you kind of approach realism, you get to this uncomfortable spot, and you eventually can get past it to the point where it's just real, right? So in virtual humans, which is where the uncanny valley comes from, at the far end, you have things like Pinocchio. Right at the uncanny valley, you have this Japanese robot. And then at the far right, you actually have a real human being, or maybe it's a synthetic human being. Maybe I'm a robot right now. In virtual reality, you have kind of the same thing. You have really immersive gaming rigs, and that gets to a really cool point. But then you get into kind of virtual reality, which is, I think, what happened in the early 90s. And then you eventually just get to the holodeck, right? And that's precisely what I mean by crossing that uncanny valley. And I'm going to talk about some of those perceptual systems. And while I talk about some of those perceptual systems, I will talk about the specific things that we're doing at Disney to address some of those perceptual system problems. So what I mean by perceptual systems, I, of course, mean the 5 senses, right? We know touch, sight, smell, sound, and taste. But of course, there's kind of the 6th sense that not a lot of people talk about, and that is proprioception. And proprioception is the sense by which we know intuitively where our limbs are. Dancers have very good proprioception. I have very terrible proprioception, and I have the bruises on my leg and stubbed toes to prove it. So if you think about the human perceptual system, it's really about your body's I/O, right? We have inputs into our own system, and that is our senses. And then, of course, we have output, which is speech, which is singing, which is me perhaps using my hands to do a painting. And if you think about VR and what that is, it's really about spoofing the input to the human perceptual system. Creating immersive experiences is about spoofing that input. So now let's talk about the 2 major ones that have to do with VR, which is vision and proprioception. And when it's bad, and when we're in that uncanny valley, is when there is an input mismatch. And that is to say that we have these perceptual systems that are very tuned in our heads, that when there is a mismatch between some of those perceptual systems, it happens to be that we're evolved to detect that that's us being poisoned. Because really, in nature, when those get a mismatch, you are effectively being poisoned. And I would actually have to say that all of us have experienced this in our real life, even if we've never touched VR, because it so happens that alcohol does exactly the same thing. That is to say that motion sickness feels a lot like being drunk because it is. When you have those visual perceptions systems mismatch, that is literally your body saying, oh no, I'm being poisoned, please eject everything. So let's first talk about your eyes. It's very hard to talk about eyes without first describing light fields. Who in this room knows what a light field is by show of hands? Sadly, not as many. So light fields is exactly what I mean. When you have a light source, such as the sun and a scene, we know that we see, and we know that light bounces off of those objects. And we know that those, in turn, bounce off of them, and they cause what is effectively a light field. So when we capture that, we are actually compressing that light field. And camera technology really hasn't changed for a very long time. Has anybody ever made one of these, a pinhole camera, as a child? Right, so all that does is it takes this light field, and it effectively compresses it by putting a little hole in it such that some of those rays get blocked. So that when you hold up a piece of paper in this room right now, it's just illuminated, right? But if I put a little hole in it, I've now filtered out all of the bounces that don't necessarily fit into this hole. And once I have this hole, I now have an image because I filtered out all of that light. And that effectively is how a pinhole camera works. Now, a light field is actually that entire field. So when you capture an image, you're throwing away all of that beautiful data because you're not capturing the entire light field. So that is a pinhole camera, and that's actually how modern-day cameras work. If you think about the aperture on your camera, that exact thing is the tiny hole that the light has to go through. Now, of course, we have some very complex lensing now to let some more light in, but in the end, it's still pretty much the same thing. And in fact, nature follows this. So if you look at some of the creatures that are perhaps more simple, like the Nautilus, there's literally a pinhole camera on the Nautilus. And of course, as I said, just like pinhole cameras kind of evolved to have lenses, so too did mammals. And mammals basically is the same pinhole camera model, but now we add a lens, and we effectively get this. So let's talk about the back, or rather the image sensor of our eyes, if you really think about this as a camera. So first, let's talk about spatial resolution. By the way, I hate these type of images that talk about, like, look how much more crisp 4K is compared to 1080. That's actually all kind of crap, and I will tell you why. And it is because if you take a look at the eye, some people are like, how high resolution do I actually need in my system to be considered eye-limiting resolution? In other words, what is the resolution of my eyes? Turns out that's kind of a trick question because your eye's resolution is variable, unlike a regular CCD. And really, all of the resolution is concentrated just at the tiny center of it called the fovea. And the other thing is the fact that we have this wide field of view. Instantaneously, we have about 120-degree field of view, but we actually have these things called eye muscles that allow us to move our eyes around, which actually gives us a much wider field of view. So if you think about it in terms of how high resolution is enough, well, how far away are you from the screen? Because it's really about pixels per degree, not about the absolute resolution. Even if I have the lowest resolution monitor, if I'm 100 feet away from it, it still looks crystal clear to me because I can't see the pixels. But if I have the most dense screen, like a 4K screen, and I put my face up to it, it's still pretty low resolution. So as a general rule of thumb, it's about 1 pixel per 2 arc minutes, or if you want to think about it for an HD display, that means you have to be about 1.5 times the screen height away for you to be eye-limiting. Granted, this is for somebody with 20/20 vision. So if you're a fighter pilot, for example, you have sometimes twice the pixel density in your eyes as the regular human being. So in terms of 4K screens, everybody's shouting to get those 4K screens. You actually have to be you have to be around 0.7 times screen height to be at eye-limiting resolution. That means that most 4K displays sitting in your living room, you are actually already surpassed that. So why even get a 4K screen? Well, it turns out it's actually really good for VR. So let's talk about why resolution is important. The original head-mounted display, the Virtuality I talked about in 1994, this had 1.3 pixels per degree, very, very shallow. This is something that not a lot of people know about, which is the Fake Space Labs Wide 5. This was the first head-mounted display that used a panel as well as a fisheye lens, a very similar design to the Oculus, used at USC by some guys at USC. This had about 5.4 pixels per degree, so far higher at this point. Now, what's interesting about this is this design is one of the first things that I would say some of the founders of Oculus saw when they were going to school, and that, of course, led to exactly this, the DK1 and the DK2, one at 5 pixels per degree, very similar to the previous one that I just showed, and now the DK2 at 10.8 pixels. So we're not really quite at eye-limiting resolution, which is why I think there are so many talks now talking about anti-aliasing, because now all of a sudden that becomes a real problem. How high do you actually need to get? Remember, resolution is inversely proportional to the field of view, and I said that you kind of need a really wide field of view. So if you have the same wide field of view as the Wide 5, which, by the way, to me is still the most immersive in terms of field of view that I've seen, at 180 degrees and 88 degrees bias down, that's about 60 pixels per degree. You need about 10K of resolution, which is really freaking high. So for real-time rendering guys that are out there, this is your problem to solve. So let's talk a little bit about distance and resolution, right? When you're closer to the screen, you obviously have a wider field of view. Now, one of the things is, okay, that's fine. I can now get the resolution that I need by being further away from the screen. But now I have a narrower field of view. So what if I want to increase my field of view and have the resolution? Well, it turns out you can have this cheat, right? You can just add more screens. And at some point, you enclose the entire person in screens, and that is precisely what a cave is. And this is something that we've used at Imagineering. So if you guys have been to Disney's California Adventure in the last few years, we have soaring over California, which is IMAX 70mm stock. This is the highest resolution film that we can possibly have, and it immerses all of our guests. And I would argue that this, for some of our guests, depending on where you sit, is at eye-limiting resolution. We have also just created Disneyland Paris's Ratatouille ride, which uses 3D projection. These are multiple 4K projectors blended onto a spherical screen. Again, at eye-limiting resolution. Internally, we have something called the Digital Immersive Showroom, which is a VR cave that we use to visualize our theme park attractions prior to them ever being built. Each and every single one of these walls is a 4K projectors. Depending on where you stand in this room, you are literally at 180-degree field of view, and you have full eye-limiting resolution almost at all points. Of course, you can also cheat right now while we're waiting for Moore's Law to catch up. You can use foveated rendering. This is the idea that because we have the fovea and because we can track your eyes now, if we can track your eyes fast enough, we can render just the high resolution part at where your fovea is. So this is another thing. So going beyond spatial resolution, there's this thing called temporal resolution, right? Which is right now what we call frame rate. How high frame rate do you actually need? And I really want to say that this is not, again, an absolute thing. This is also a relative thing. So beyond spatial resolution, right, we have, of course, The Hobbit at high frame rate that caused some angst amongst fans. And of course, we have Avatar, right, which was also shot at high frame rate that caused a little bit of angst. So let's talk about why frame rate is important. That's one of the things that's called motion blur, right? So in terms of motion blur, if I sample a point, right, and I sample that across some speed x, across some motion, across some sensor, right, through a pinhole camera, if I double that speed, I now have less motion blur. And eventually, I just have no motion blur. But this happens in your eyes as well. In fact, you can see motion blur on a day-to-day basis. So if you focus at your finger in front of you and you wave your finger in front of you, you can actually see motion blur. Now what's interesting is if you take that finger away and you focus on this one, there's actually much less motion blur. And that is because you have these guys in your eyes. Your eyes move. And that causes something that we like to call judder. How many of you guys know what judder is? All right, slightly less. So judder is this very interesting effect, right? I just showed that motion blur happens. But turns out your eyes, because you want to see a tiger coming at you, actually can track objects really well, right? So that means when you have a flashing of an object, which is what happens on a monitor, you effectively have an object here. As your eyes are tracking it, it actually doesn't move because it's a flash, so you get a smear across your eye. But then it updates, and now all of a sudden it becomes clear again. So you actually start seeing this kind of pulsating motion, and that's precisely what judder is. And this is, of course, something that can be solved with higher frame rate, which is why I think you're starting to see head-mounted displays with more frame rate. Now, there's a ton of other things, such as the actual LCDs and how they refresh, but one of the things that you can really avoid here is not doing double motion blur, right? Because if you motion blur in your computer graphics, then you're motion blurring and tracking and causing judder at the same time. So just remember, when you're designing your experiences, don't double motion blur. Instead, just focus on increasing your frame rate. So if you take a look at Star Tours, we did this one at 60 hertz per eye, right? The Hobbit was at 48 hertz. We did this one at 60 hertz per eye. And then, of course, in our internal one, because we can play with it forever, we actually have done some tests where we do some videos at 120 hertz. And I will have to say, depending on how fast that motion is, sometimes 120 hertz isn't fast enough. So let's go back to the eye structure, and let's talk about the last thing, which is the lens. So this lens, we have two muscles that can kind of pull it tighter and looser, and that causes us to focus. So how many of you guys understand depth of field and how that works, right? The depth of field is really kind of taking that light field that we have, and instead of collapsing it into a single infinitesimally small point, we, of course, need a slightly larger point, and that causes it to have a slightly blurred effect, right? So in terms of on a light field, right, depth of field is really just an artifact because we can't see the entire light field at the same time. But if you capture the entire light field, which is precisely what the Lytro camera does, you can actually adjust that depth of field on the fly. But wouldn't it be great if you can actually display a light field as well, right? Wouldn't it be great if we can change that focus? And by the way, your proprioception to the muscles on your eyes versus where you focus on, there is a very specific term for it, and that's convergence disparity. In terms of that, you are also causing a mismatch between the inputs into your own body. And that's precisely what NVIDIA did last year with their light field display. They actually had a display where you put onto your eyes, they're using lenslets, required a lot of calibration, but you can actually see a light field. You can focus on something that was as close as this to something that's much further away, and you can actually feel it in your eyes. So in order to review, let's stop doing cinematic quality rendering, because cinema is all about real life captured by a camera, and VR is all about real life captured by our eyes. So as review, motion blur, depth of field, high frame rate, and of course, you can still use them. Make sure that you know what you're doing, and you can still use them for artistic effect. So going back to the eye structure, there's one final thing that I hadn't talked about, which is, of course, the optic nerve. This actually goes somewhere, right? After you capture all of that stuff, it goes into your brain. So let's talk about beyond eyes. And this is, of course, the entire visual system at this point. So we get a sense of depth, right, from the Oculus. A lot of people are saying that's stereo vision. That's where we get that sense of depth. Turns out, I, and along with many of my colleagues, this is actually the most important thing for looking at depth. It is the motion tracking, because let's face it, plenty of people have zero stereo vision at all, and they can survive in the world just fine. Because motion parallax is more important than stereoscopy. We are able to see depth not because of stereo, but mostly because of motion parallax, which is why perspective correct rendering is so important. And if you don't know what this is, I highly recommend that you look this up. But it's really the simple concept of, if I have an image plane of which I am rendering some computer graphics from, if I move that point, I still can do all of that math. And in fact, this is exactly why GL Frustum has a left, right, bottom, top, near, and far. Why do you think that there is a left and a right and a top and a bottom and not just a field of view setting? It is because you can do off-axis rendering like this. And in fact, head tracking is something that we're now starting to see finally in consumer electronics. You can see it on the Amazon Fire Phone. And this is precisely what we do for many of our theme park attractions. In fact, this is one of our favorite tricks. So in Disneyland Paris Ratatouille, as you ride around, you can actually see we render the scene, because instead of tracking your head, we know exactly where the vehicle is. As you ride around, the scene actually follows you, and the rendering perspective actually follows you as you go around, and it gives you a much better sense of depth. And this is a thing that's now used in many theme park attractions. But sometimes you can't always track the person, or sometimes, for example, for a Disney theme park, you have a first vehicle, second vehicle problem, right? You can't snap the eye point back to somebody because now all of a sudden you see a snap. So the one thing I want to stress is that it's really about perspective correct rendering, but when you can't do that, you can get away with relative motion. This is all about relative motion as you move. So in Toy Story Midway Mania, this is an attraction that we've done in Disney's California Adventure, in which guests get to pull these blasters to shoot 3D objects into a 3D scene. What's really cool about this is that in the last scene, you're actually moving as you're firing. Of course, we wanted some perspective correct rendering on this, but you can't because there's two vehicles that are very close to each other. So in order to get that full sense of depth, you can actually just cheat the motion parallax exactly how, well, most Flash games do it, which is you move foreground and background objects at a relative speed, calculated by exactly where you think what the relative motion should be, and you can get a depth effect like that. And of course, going back to our digital immersive showroom, we have 480 hertz optical tracking in this room plus an IMU. So that allows us to track, of course, just one person. And that's what gives this and most caves its kind of really nice 3D effect, is the head tracking. So going back to spatial perception, one of the things I really want to talk about also is now proprioception, right? We have a general idea of where our hands are. However, we also use our bodies as a sense of reference. So if you think about what's happening in VR right now, hand tracking is a big thing. And all of a sudden, they're like, oh my God, hand tracking, it's really important. Turns out before, people were like, oh my God, hand tracking, it's really important. Going beyond that, we also, of course, can do full body motion capture while you're doing this. Now, why is this important? It's because scale and distances are much harder to judge without a reference point, right? On the internet, when you see something, I don't know how many of you guys are on Reddit or Imagineering or whatever, but they say banana for scale, right? How many of you guys know what that is? Okay. you need something that's a relative scale for something. And it turns out your body is your ultimate scale. I know how tall this podium is because I'm standing next to it and I can see my body next to it. But in a head-mounted display, your body disappears. You no longer have that reference point. So it's much harder for you to get that reference point. Now, as we do hand tracking and as we do full body tracking, and as we get more of the real world into virtual reality and perhaps augmented reality, then you gain that thing back. So in terms of judging scale and distances, having your own body is really important, and that's one of the reasons why we, of course, like caves slightly better than head-mounted displays when you are trying to judge scale and distance, which is, of course, very important when you're designing theme parks. Of course, there are other ways of just not caves, right? There are other displays out there that you can do that still give you kind of an AR feeling and still give you the sense of your own body. So Cast AR is a company in which you have specialized retroreflective screens, but they actually mount projectors on your head. And using that, you can now project the 3D scene from your head and it comes back into your eyes by bouncing off a screen. And we can do all the visual correction within those little projectors and the 3D media generated there. But what's cool about that is now you have a head system instead of a giant VR display where you get to see your hands. Now, I have no idea what Magic Leap is, but I do know that on their website, they have your hands. It's because this is really important. Having that reference point is extremely important. So if you look at spatial perception again, right, there's kind of more systems in there, right? We also have this thing in your inner ear called the cochlea. And in your cochlea, you actually have these hairs that you can hear with, but those hairs also are your body's internal accelerometer. And that accelerometer can kind of tell you your current pitch, your current yaw, and of course how you're moving. That's important because now tracking is everywhere, right? We have the Kinect, we have the Prime Sense, which I figured about up, but we have all of these different types of tracking, and I really want to talk about tracking quality. So for those of you guys that are doing experiments at home, I actually recommend these cameras. These are fairly inexpensive, and they are much faster in terms of their latency at tracking an object than your Kinect. And that's where I want to get into latency. But I want to talk first about total latency and latency variability. There's been a lot of focus on end-to-end total latency, which is the time that it takes for your tracker to talk to your render, and finally for your render to render out a thing, and then finally go into your buffer for displaying, and then finally your display, which also has a buffer, to actually turning it into photons into your eyes. This has been discussed ad nauseum about just about everywhere, right? And they talk about reducing this at all costs, because this is ultimately what separates that mismatch between your inner ear, where you think you should be, your proprioception, where you think you should be, and what you see in your eyes. But the one thing I want to stress is that actually the variability of latency also causes motion sickness, and there's plenty of papers that discuss this. Lots of people talk about predictive filtering, and if predictive filtering is awesome, but use it with caution, because predictive filtering also means latency variability. Because with predictive filtering, if you do it wrong, you can actually get negative latency, right? The thing is ahead of where you are. So now your latency is different from your last frame to your current frame, and that causes nausea. Because it turns out that your brain is really good at adapting to things. And when it adapts, it can adapt to variability, but not too much variability in the latency and the mismatch. So once you wear it for a while, you can actually adapt to a fair amount of latency. But if that varies all the time, you can never do that, which is why latency causes some motion sickness. So in review of this section, quality translational tracking is important because motion parallax is super important. Proprioception and body awareness used in spatial perception. Remember, we need reference points. So even if I don't have my body in a VR experience, maybe put something in there. Maybe try to have something that gives me a reference. And of course, when you're talking about latency, don't just worry about the total latency, also worry about the consistency of latency. So finally, talking a little bit about design, or rather just some quick guidelines. So let's fast forward, let's say a few years, maybe a decade, when we have perfect VR. Even if you have perfect VR, you will still get sick. And why do I say this? Because I know for a fact that what makes you motion sick in real life will also make you sick in VR. And what do I mean by this? In 3D shooters right now, you can do what is called zero-point turns, and that is to say this. If you guys stood up right now and did that, and let's just do that for like, I don't know, 20 seconds, I guarantee you some of you guys will be dizzy, and I guarantee you some of you guys will be sick. Because it turns out, even if you have the perfect VR experience, if you do things that make you sick in real life, you'll still be sick. So when you're designing your VR experiences now, when we don't have perfect VR, avoid fast player rotations. Use design to make sure that you don't do 0-point turns, right? When we walk around not in 0 points, but when we look at an object, we actually rotate around the object. There's always translation involved and not just rotation. Another thing, many people love direct manipulation, mostly because I think of Iron Man in this movie. Direct manipulation is, of course, taking an object in VR and actually being able to manipulate it. So I want you guys to do something for me. I want you to hold up your arms. Hold up your arms right now. So this is direct manipulation, right? Now imagine that you have an entire workday, exactly like this, and you have to hold it up like this for about 6 hours. All right, keep holding it up. No, I'm kidding. Don't do that. There's another thing that's really interesting, which is many people are interested in direct navigation. And by the way, this is something the military uses quite often. We have companies like Omni doing direct navigation in which you have to run to get to a specific point. I love this. That means that like gamers are getting off their butts and actually becoming active. And I love this because it increases the sense of immersion. But if you think about VR experiences, or actually let's not think about VR experiences, how many of you guys recognize this? Did anybody ever play the long jump in this? By show of hands. The trick to playing long jump in this, right? You had to actually like run, right? And then you had to jump to pretend you were long jumping and then land back on the mat. Everybody would just run really fast as fast as they can, jump off of the mat, wait like 5 seconds, jump back on the mat, and you're like, hooray, you're like an Olympic long jumper. And that is because nobody is an Olympic long jumper. They want to feel powerful. They want to win. Direct navigation, direct manipulation are great, but think about the medium that you're in. You as game designers know about a good experience. I don't want to be winded when I walk from one end to the other, and I certainly don't want to be winded when I'm trying to just work all day. It turns out the mouse and keyboard, really low energy, which is why you can use VR to do things like this. How cool will it be to be a bird? How cool will it be to ride a magic carpet? And by the way, this is from Disney Quest in the early 90s, in which you get to fly a magic carpet, right? Because we knew that, I mean, granted, direct navigation had a bunch of technical challenges as well, but it made you feel powerful. It made you be able to fly around Agrabah and have a magical experience, and that's what VR is all about. There's this thing that my old professors used to talk about, which is if you created the ultimate working VR experience in which you can now simulate everything, that means you can have the most intuitive interface. If I wanted to type up an email, I could take out a virtual typewriter and start typing on it. If I wanted to have a video conferencing call, I can just pick up the phone and like push a button. If I had to look up contacts, I can just pull out my Rolodex. Do you guys even know what Rolodexes are? I can pull out my Rolodex and look, what have you done? Right? You've just created the regular office. Like, use VR for what it's good for. So one other thing is, of course, in VR, and I'm super glad that this is now happening, is that there is no defined scale in VR. I don't care how big you are. You can be Godzilla or you can be Remy. So if you think about some of the things that's already been explored in the past, there's this nice interaction technique that one of my old professors actually loved, which was the world of miniature. So if I wanted to decorate a house, I can actually have a tiny version of the house, and I can move objects within that house. But then at the same time, in the real, much larger version, the one-to-one scale, I can now see that large piece of furniture moving. Now what's cool about this is it's still direct manipulation in terms of I'm manipulating a tiny version of it, but the range in which I have to move this tiny chair is far less than if I had to actually walk over to the chair, pick up the chair, move it, and go to another area. And we, of course, again, do this in our theme parks. Going back to Disneyland Paris Ratatouille, you are literally Remy, or rather you're smaller than Remy because you're riding around in a Ratmobile. We also, of course, have done this forever, and this is where I'm going to jump out on a limb here and say, we've done this forever. People like tiny things. You don't necessarily have to make immersive experiences with pixels. You can also make it out of real objects. So the Storybook Canal in Disneyland is, of course, you get to ride through all of these enchanted storybook places where we just made things really small. And that, of course, makes people feel intimate, feel quite powerful. In terms of designing your experiences, again, help your players perceive the world through motion cues, right? I already said that you use your body as a piece of reference, and you don't always have that. So when you design your scenes, when you design your virtual reality scenes, even though we don't have perfect VR and we don't have perfect tracking, try to take advantage of planes of motion, because planes of motion is what allows us, for example, there's a microphone over there. I can tell the difference of that microphone as I'm moving my head. But if everything is far away on one plane, I have no reference. I have no idea how large the room is unless I move around a lot. So make sure to design your things with many planes of motion. And if you look at some of our older VR attractions, that's exactly what happens. So let's talk about some of your other senses. Another big thing in VR right now is, of course, haptics, right? And this is your ultimate sense of touch. And I like to call this section, VR sword fighting is horrible. VR sword fighting is horrible because in sword fighting, it's all about the instantaneous force that happens when two swords clash. And it turns out that force is massive. If you think about instantaneous force and what happens on a baseball or a tennis racket, it's enough to bend a wooden bat. That is a lot of force. So how do you do this? Well, you can't in VR right now because the response time of that is instantaneous and it's so fast. But you can do it. You guys are all smart. You guys are all designers. Maybe you can have a sword so sharp that you can't feel it. Or have it cheat right now and match the real world. There was a VR experience at a university in which people created just a pit. And they also created a room in which there was, I believe, a 1-inch lip. And that 1-inch lip was a board that matched exactly a virtual board or virtual plank out into a cliff. You can walk on that plank, but when you look down, instead of a 1-inch lip, you saw a 1,000-foot fall. But you could feel with your shoes, doesn't matter what you're wearing, that that had a lip, it had a 1-inch lip. When instructed to jump off of the plank, I forget what the percentage was, but it's very close to 0. Actually jumped off. And that's because when you're immersed like that, when you actually have matching haptics, it's a great experience. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm so excited about VR that's now actually putting your own body into it, because it turns out you also touch yourself a lot. And touching yourself is also a form of haptics, right? You can have actual physical objects, and those physical objects will give you the real haptics. So matching real-world objects until we can get really amazing haptics, such as in the holodeck, will give you instant feedback. So let's just think to the future for a second. Maybe there are some people that are working on some really cool haptics, or maybe some people are just trying to create the T-1000. And in fact, people are. So at Disney Research, there's actually this project that was called CADMS, in which people were making tiny robots that could form on top of one another. And if you had millions of these and you could change their colors, you can literally create anything. Of course, the prototypes were much larger, but in the end, what they were trying to create was actually the T-1000. So people are actually working on this. But before that, let's talk a little bit about how maybe you can just take the room that you're in and make it come alive. Maybe you can name it Room Alive. Maybe you're from Microsoft Research, and that's precisely what this is, right? It took your living room, scanned your living room, made a virtual representation of your living room, and used digital projection to be able to project objects onto it. And plus head tracking, I can now correct for all of those surfaces and actually make some of those surfaces disappear, or make some things like this tiny robot here pop off of the actual wall, and I can create gameplay experiences like that. And if I create active game experiences like that in which I can actually have to touch the wall or touch a specific object, that object is there. I'm touching a physical thing. Haptics kind of comes for free. So this kind of brings me to the point of how Disney has been using physical objects, but just augmenting them with projection to be able to create magical things. So we just recently redid Indiana Jones. In Indiana Jones, there's this giant statue of Mara. And it used to be that it was just a statue that was scenically lit. We have since augmented it with projection so that because it's a face, you get all of the motion parallax for free, because it's real motion parallax, because there's an actual physical object there. But with projection, you can now change the material properties. Or for those of you guys that are computer graphics guys, the BDRF, of the actual object. And with tracking, remember I said tracking is also important, motion parallax isn't the only thing that changes as you move. Specularity also changes. So we can track the specularity, and the specularity changes as you approach Mara and as you go around the corner. And of course, we can augment Mara with all of these nice effects, such as turning them into gold or even into a purple crystal. We, in Tokyo, also have an attraction called Goofy's Paint and Playhouse, in which we take generic-looking objects, augment them with projection, and now we can immerse all of these kids in Goofy's room. But what's cool about this is they can take these blasters and now change what some of these are. So for example, you have Goofy's couch there. As you shoot it, because the shape is generic enough, we can actually turn it into a Jeep. Or you can see that there's a waterfall on the side there. That used to be a fireplace. So we can change all of these things with just very limited changes to its material properties. So just remember that virtual reality kind of goes beyond just head mounts. You can also use all of these other tools at your disposal that are available right now to create amazing experiences. So going beyond all of those things, we of course also have smell and taste. I have to say that the Walt Disney Company has not done a lot with taste because there's some hygiene issues with that. But have no fear, there's plenty of academia that does it. And in fact, this was a thing from SIGGRAPH a few years ago. This was a smello machine at Emerging Technologies. What's cool about this is that your sense of taste is directly affected by your sense of smell. And with this, they can inject different smells. And you see a little camera there. They would actually baked sugar cookies that had a fiducial on it, where it would recognize the cookie as you're eating it and then inject the smell so that you can make a sugar cookie taste like a peanut butter cookie or an Oreo, depending on the smell that it injected. That is to say, while we haven't messed with taste, we have messed with smell. There are plenty of attractions, such as Disney's Soarin' Over California, that uses smell-o-vision. So you can see on this particular shot that there are these little pucks that are right above everybody, right? Those things are actually fans with pellets in them. So as you approach the orange fields, as you approach the pine fields in California, it will pump out pine smell or orange smell, thus immersing you in that space even further because now you have that sense of smell. So, in review, remember, VR, it's more than just head mounts. And please remember about the human vision system when you're actually designing these things. Your eye is not a camera. It's not cinema. It's your eyes. Consistency of latency is just as important as total latency. Really think about it. And immersion is all about cues. And really, really take advantage of the V in VR. And that is the end of my talk. My name is Bei Yang. Follow me on Twitter. Are there any questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. So I've always been fascinated by the common ground between video games and, Disney rides and things like that. Video games are my life, but the most impressive and emotional experience I've ever had was on a ride called Mission Space in Epcot. And the thing that blew me away most about that was I was in fucking space. It was amazing, I was so blown away. And I see with rides like, the reworking of Star Tours, where there's actually different locations you can visit and stuff.
That's right, yes.
One thing video games have over the kind of immersive experience is that those are all single experiences. So like your Ratatouille ride is a branded single ride with a very definite experience inside it. I was just wondering your thoughts on Disney or any parks moving towards a kind of system that would provide multiple experiences in that complete immersion, like, projection caves and everything, where you can get multiple experiences, swap out cartridges or games like you do with video games.
So I won't speak to anything that we're currently working on, but I will say that that is something that we've been thinking about for a very long time. So just to repeat the question is Disney working on things in which we can swap out the experience? And yes, we have been thinking about them, and I will tell you some of the problems that we have been trying to solve. And that's number one, when you go to a Disney theme park, many of the people that are going there, it's their first time going. So having kind of expert systems, which is something, if you have a game, because the barrier to entry to playing a game in your living room is so much lower than packing all your bags and going to a Disney park, we really kind of have to focus on that first-time experience. But for our returning guests, yes, absolutely, that's something that we're thinking about. However, in doing so, how do you make sure that when you're going through, how do we identify you as a returning player? And how do we actually make it so that if you're just there alone, the 3 other people that are riding with you are also of that same skill level, right? So those are all kind of questions that we have to solve. But I will say also that with the emergence of real-time rendering, with the emergence of better kind of computer graphics and design, this is something that's becoming more possible. So yes, it's something that we are thinking about pretty heavily.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it seems like we're increasing essentially the bit rate of information coming into the body in VR. Have you guys had done any experiments, or do you have any information about how that impacts actions per minute on the part of the player or the user?
Can you say that one more time?
Like, can they make as many choices and be as an active participant as, say, in StarCraft, where people are measured in button clicks per minute or per second?
Right. So again, this is something that's a little bit hard for theme parks. And the reason for that is because if you think about StarCraft and you think about just, I mean, in the world of human-computer interaction, there's novice users and expert users, right? Sure. If you think about the world of StarCraft, it's like all the way at the far end of expert users. For expert users, in terms of how optimized the system is, it's really important. But for the novice user, it's all about learnability. And if you think about theme park attractions, because we have to design things all the way from the 2-year-old all the way up to 60 years old, 100 years old, it becomes very difficult to make an expert system. So we much more focus on the learnability of something. So have we done studies in terms of expert systems? Not for guests, but we have for internal tools, right? And in fact, I can show you something. In terms of actions per minute, it's all about kind of parallelization. So one of the things that we've been looking at is using virtual reality as an actual form of content generation. So how do you actually sit in a cave, and instead of having just the mouse and keyboard input, you can now be able to move around, which is another part of the input, because now we have motion tracking, but also be able to use your hands. So if you look at Dane here, who's demoing this, he has 2 custom-built controllers in his hand that are made with phones, and he can actually build a house using SketchUp inside our VR cave. He can also navigate with 2 hands in a very intuitive way. But what's cool about this is if you think about using Maya or whatever, you're kind of orbiting around something, right? But now we can actually orbit as well as pan at the same time, and it's just very natural, right? And if you think about SketchUp, if you've ever used SketchUp and you want to punch a hole through something, you kind of have to make a circle, punch a hole, rotate so that you go to the back of the thing, and then actually have the hole. But in VR, because you can actually just walk around the object, you can make the hole, walk around the object, and then punch the hole through. It's just one action. So in terms of parallelizing that, that is something that we're really looking at for work.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I want to thank you first of all, for a great talk.
You're welcome.
It was really insightful. I wanted to learn more about, so at Disney you have people coming in that are sort of adults and adult size, and then kids and that are kid size, and that affects everything from your IPD to how big you perceive your body to be.
Yeah.
Do you have just more insight on designing for those differences?
Yeah. So if you take a look at this shot, it really kind of goes back to every other GDC talk, which is just test, test, and test. I mean, we test a lot. So if you think about just that blaster alone, we went through probably around 6 iterations of how to actually design that thing. And if you look at the lap bar on that person, remember this is to fit a tiny, I believe this goes all the way up to 4 years old, all the way down to somebody that's perhaps a little bit bigger. And the final design is actually a lap bar that pulls down on you, and the blaster actually is connected to the lap bar, and it goes closer to you. And you'll also notice that it's a little pull string. So we had all of these tests where should we do a pull string, should we do a button, should we do 2 buttons, what should we do? And we just tested this with many different age groups, with many different size people, and ultimately came down to this design. And before, the lap bar was on kind of like this parallelogram system. Before we actually did that, we had this huge problem where if you had somebody that was really big, the controller was actually too close to you and you couldn't actually pull the string. And for little kids, they couldn't actually reach it. So, I mean, test. Like, that's really the only way.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
So the video you just showed might have answered my question, but I wanted to ask more about user interaction paradigms.
Okay.
So you talked about direct manipulation and the world in miniature model, and so those are the two that I see a lot in caves, along with the kind of like laser pointer telekinetic stab things at a distance and movement model. So I was just wondering if there are other user interaction methods that you've come across that have been successful alternatives.
You must be an academic because you just use some terms. Yeah, all of those things that you mentioned are still things that we look at, and it's kind of odd because not a lot of people are picking those up, even though they're quite good in terms of how fast and intuitive they are. Yes, we are looking at those, and yes, you can actually see the paper about that immersive modeling, which was just published under Dane Coffrey and Mark Mine. So you can actually read all about that immersive modeling and how the interaction techniques they're using in that one is kind of changing the way that we're thinking about how we do 3D modeling.
Yeah.
So I would really recommend you read that paper.
Thanks.
Great talk. I'm really enjoying it. Nicole Lazaro from Zio Design. My question is, you gave some great advice, which is, in VR, let's think about experiences, don't think about games. But I was curious, when you can imagine like what might work on like a head-mounted display, what do you feel like, what game genres or what experience genres would work well? Do you think is the most promising?
So genres is a little bit hard because some of them just don't map super well to VR. But I will say there are certain mechanics that, actually I wouldn't even say mechanics, I would say things that are much more about inducing emotion through immersion. So things like horror genre is one of the easiest things now to do in VR because you're completely immersed, and especially in a head-mounted display where like one of the things about going to a scary movie with friends is that like your friends are right next to you. When you put on a head-mounted display, it's an extremely isolating experience, which lends itself to the horror genre. There's a couple other things in terms of, again, going to World of Miniature. If you're playing a real-time strategy game, again, I said you don't have to control scale, right? Doing real-time strategy, as long as you can get some of the direct manipulation stuff, and being in a God view, whatever you need for, like, whatever games in which you can have a God view, also very, very satisfying. Things that are that require immersion, things like racing games, flight simulators, again, work really well in head-mounted displays. But really kind of think about the fact that head-mounted displays right now, as it stands, is a very isolating experience, and what matches very well to isolating single kind of handed experiences, such as driving, horror genre, or anything like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the talk. It's been absolutely fantastic. I wanted to ask a little bit about user comfort. It's obviously an area you have to concentrate on a lot.
Yeah.
If you've got a user in an experience and you detect they're having a bad experience, they're not enjoying it, how do you kind of cope with that? What are your thoughts around that, and any of that might apply back to using virtual reality, kind of detecting that they're not having a good time, and
Can
how
you
do you
repeat
pick that
the
up?
last 3 sentences? That wasn't.
Sorry, yeah. If you're having a user that's having a bad experience, what are the elegant ways of kind of getting them out of there that you guys use? You don't want to kind of distract everybody else that's on the ride. You don't want to kind of cause problems. You don't have to stop the ride. So I just wondered if you had any insight onto that.
So the question was, how do you prevent people from having bad experiences, and how do you recover from bad experiences? Yeah. So preventing bad experiences, I think the way that we do it the most often is controlling expectations.
Yeah.
Telling people what to expect ultimately gives them kind of self-filtering. So if you look at all of a lot of our attractions, this is not just VR experiences, this is all experiences. If it's a high thrill ride, we make it such that you know it's a high thrill ride, right? If you look at Test Track at Epcot right now, the car zips right through the queue. You can see it, right? You're like, yep, that is for me, or nope, I'm out of here. And we run into this problem, actually. So if you look at Mission Space, I think somebody mentioned Mission Space before, there you spin on a centrifuge to feel G-forces. There is, I believe, I'm going to forget the team names. I believe there's an orange team and a green team. Might be a blue team. The orange team is the more intense one, where the centrifuge is actually on, and I believe the green one is the one where it's a little bit more shallow and you have it off, right? And in that particular experience, you have to really tell the guest which one they're about to go on, because if they are expecting a very severe experience and they get the opposite, or vice versa, you'll have a bad experience. So preventing those experiences is all about expectations, right? In terms of recovery, I can't say that much because I'm not a huge expert in terms of how we do guest services, but I do know that they do a fantastic job in terms of making sure that our guests, when they have a bad experience, that they have some place to go to in which they can essentially talk about the grievances, and we try to our best to try and accommodate that, right? To say that we do something with design, I'm not sure what, I don't think we really have anything that's there, but that's definitely something to think about, so thank you.
Okay. That's great, thank you.
Hi, so when you bring virtual reality HMDs to theme parks like Disney, one of the concerns is hygiene. So if you have like thousands of people using these headsets, how do you make a rugged version of, say, like a virtual reality headset that can withstand like the brutalness of people using it over and over and over? Like, what would you suggest to solve that hygiene problem?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you solve hygiene in perhaps head-mounted displays and virtual reality in theme parks? This is a problem that we've thought long and hard about. Turns out like pink eye is really contagious. And you're strapping something to your face, which is exactly how everybody in the park gets pink eye. Yeah, that's a huge problem. If you look at all of our 3D attractions that require 3D glasses, those are plastic 3D glasses that have very large, and I will also add very expensive, laundry facilities on campus that wash and sterilize all of those things. When you have a bit of electronics that has that as well, it is far harder. So we have, of course, looked at head-mounted displays, and if you think about the current design of most head-mounted displays, there's the kind of the electronics, and then there's the lens. And if you can make the lens washable and detachable, you can at least break it off into pieces, such that now you can have somebody, as we're handing you a head-mounted display, putting the lens back on. Granted, now, for a theme park, that now takes one additional cast member to be assembling that, which increases our load time, which increases all of this stuff, which now means like we have less capacity on the ride, and that's something that we always look for. So it's this very complicated balance. I don't think we've quite figured that out yet, but that's a question that we're constantly looking at and thinking about, which is why most of our attractions that we have built in the past are more cave-based experiences and not things that you strap to your head, because hygiene is a huge concern for us. I'm surprised nobody asked me about the dress. I was actually gonna, so this was kind of like a bonus slide. I don't really have that much time, but talk about color perception. So this is something we deal with in VR all the time, right? You have rods and cones in your eyes. And depending on how many rods and cones you have in your eyes and the density distribution of it, you will perceive color differently. And if you think about color, it's actually completely false, right? Like there's no such thing as color. Color is a completely like construct in your brain, right? Like these are just wavelengths. It's a linear scale. There's not like 3 primaries or whatever. But if you think about the way the displays work, they are way less wide than the detectors on your rods and cones, right? So there's red, green, and blue. Well, it turns out there's different displays that have different red, green, and blue. So yeah, people will perceive these differently. Also, it turns out that your rod and cone distributions are different, which means those shift. So yes, everybody will have a different perception of what a color is. And beyond just the sensor in the back of your eye, your brain is also really amazing at adapting and using it as a difference engine for accommodating for ambient light, right? You can see my shirt right here. You can see that it's mostly purple and white. But the fact is, like, these lights are changing the color of this. If I took the absolute value of this from a camera, it's not purple and white. So our brains are also compensating for all of this. And in fact, this happens so often and I have no idea why the internet blew up because this happens so often that there's actually a name for it. It's called metameric failure. And this is why movie studios pay some people top dollar to make sure that their cameras are calibrated, that their monitors are calibrated, and that the entire way working through the entire pipeline, there's actually as few metameric failures as possible. So when this blew up on the internet, I was like, oh my gosh, people are actually like talking about this very esoteric thing that unless you deal with movies or VR, you never have to deal with ever. Anyways, so this was a very interesting thing for me. All right, I think we're about out of time, so I want to thank you guys all again. Thank you for coming. Thank you for waking up.